Hi, this is Paul Mallory. Welcome to this latest video in our series of videos on the subject of freestyle thinking. And today I would like to talk to you about, ask you the question, what kind of matrix are you living in? What are we talking about? What kind of matrix are we living in? If you've seen the movie The Matrix, you may recall that the hero lived in a world where he began to question whether this was reality or whether this was something artificial. What is reality? Am I living in a constructed artificial world rather than a real world? And I'd like to propose to you that we are all, each of us, living in some kind of a matrix. In other words, the world we live in, the universe that we exist in, is largely what we perceive it to be in our heads. So we create our own story about where we live, what the world is like, the kind of circumstances we're in, how we feel about all that. And it's actually, philosophically, it's quite difficult, I think, when you come right down to it, to start to point to things that are absolutely solid, objective, and true, because so much of our reality is the story we've created about what's going on. I'll give you some examples of how this works. And in particular, our brain is a fantastic, unbelievable tool that we can't even, as humans, begin to replicate in artificial intelligence. We can't begin to get anywhere near the complexity of the brain. It's a fabulous, unbelievable organ that does these amazing things. But it also has to cope with this world that we live in, and it takes shortcuts, and it helps us by filtering out information. So in the end, we are feeling and seeing a subset of what's available. Let me give you some examples. So we live in this kind of web of beliefs, of norms, of standards, of cultural influences. Ask yourself the question, what is normal? What is normal? Just list some things that are normal. I've just come back from a fantastic holiday in Thailand, where normal over there is very different to normal where I live. In many ways, in a very beautiful way. But there are some real cultural differences. The people are a bit different. They feel a bit differently about life. I saw a taxi driver with his headpiece on still, praying to a statue of Buddha in the airport lobby. Not something you would necessarily see in other parts of the world. So people see things differently. They feel very differently about life. Normal to those people over there, in this tiny island that I went to, is very different to normal where I usually live. And that's really interesting. So think about how we perceive everything that currently surrounds us as normal, but it's only normal because we're here and we happen to have been born into this thing. We happen to have been born next to these other people who tell us what normal is. We happen to have been born with TV sets and radio sets and internet, which explains to us what's normal and what's normal. So can you see immediately, this is really all an illusion being created from all these various elements. There is a vast amount of information coming at us from everywhere. More and more data and input all the time with the internet and so on. I'd question how much of it is actually information, because information, I think, is a distillation of data down into something useful. And there is a lot of nonsense on the internet. There's a lot of data which is absolutely not useful at all. But we are being deluged with more and more information, and our brains struggle to cope with this. So we have to be really vigilant. We have to notice, we have to be aware that we're living in some kind of a matrix and ask, what is our particular matrix? You know, thinking about, what are my beliefs? What are the standards in the society I live in? What are the cultural norms? Why is this thing true? Because everybody says it is. Does that make it true, really? And couldn't a different truth be equally possible? You know, so that questioning of what is real, what is true, is really critical to freestyle thinking. It's a critical element. So we have to be vigilant. We have to notice these influences on us. We have to be aware that we're taking on board beliefs and facts as though they were reality. There's a lot of talk nowadays about fake news. What is real news? What is fake news? One person's fake news is another person's real news. And just calling something fake news day after day doesn't make it fake. Equally, calling something real doesn't make it real. So we've got to have some way of sifting and evaluating all these different things and deciding what we take on, rather than just absorbing it accidentally and unconsciously, because that's what we tend to do. The whole advertising PR industry relies on this. It relies on people just absorbing these messages unconsciously and subconsciously believing them and taking them on board. So please be more aware, be more vigilant, notice the influences on you, notice what causes you to behave the way you do, question whether it's true, question whether it's real, and just ask the question, is there another possibility? Is it possible that something slightly different is actually true? That alone will help you to make great progress. So beware of fake news, beware of people who label everything fake news in the hope that you'll believe them. No names mentioned. And be aware of being led by other people's opinions. I watched a fantastic documentary. I do recommend it to you. If you get the chance to see it, I watched a fantastic documentary on the subject of Ben Bradley the other day on the aeroplane, actually coming back from Thailand. Ben Bradley was the editor of the Washington Post during the days of Watergate and so on in the US, when there was some fantastic investigative journalism going on. And he made the comment, really the essence of being a journalist is the search for truth. It's somebody getting out there investigating and trying to discover, trying to unravel what is actually true here. So we need to be a bit more like investigative journalists. We need to be a bit more like Ben Bradley in our thinking. We need to ask the question, yeah, but is this true? Is it true for me? Do I choose to take this on as a belief? Or do I reject it? Do I weigh it and evaluate it and decide it's not for me? Our brains are very susceptible. You've heard of hypnotism. You've no doubt seen demonstrations of how powerful hypnotism can be in controlling somebody's mind, getting them to believe fantastic, unreal things. It seems hilarious to watch it sometimes, but it just shows what's possible in terms of influence on the brain. You'll be aware of things like brainwashing that have been used for military purposes and so on, of just controlling somebody's mind. Hallucinations, very common. Mass hallucinations, very common. Our brains are susceptible. They can be tricked fairly easily, more readily than we realize. There are, for example, if you go to Wikipedia and search for the term, there are around 200 cognitive biases. These are ways in which our brain copes with the deluge of information by taking shortcuts, by making things up, by generalizing, by creating stories. For example, confirmation bias is a very well-known one. We decide what we believe, and then when we search the internet or look for evidence or clues, we notice everything that confirms what we already believe. We notice the evidence for that. We don't notice the evidence to the contrary. We don't notice the evidence that would disprove what we deeply believe. So we have this inbuilt bias that proves us right all the time. So just be aware of that. Think about, well, is there any evidence to the contrary? Try to cultivate the capability of holding two opposing ideas in mind at the same time. Maybe this is true, but maybe the opposite is also true, and just weigh and sift and look for evidence for each. It's a great discipline. It's a great skill to be able to consider that either of these things might be true, and even a greater skill to consider that both of these things might be true. We live in a paradoxical world. Perhaps both of these things are true at the same time. Just think about that. These things can really open your mind to possibilities, which is the object of freestyle thinking, that we don't just get sucked and dragged along by influencers and people trying to convince us in a certain direction, that we're able to think for ourselves. So there are more than 200 of these cognitive biases, like confirmation bias. And they're there because we have this overload of information. We're trying to act and decide things very quickly in a world that changes very quickly. Remember that the information we get, even though it's massive and we get deluged by it, it's a tiny percentage of the total available information. Just think about that for a moment. All the information in the world, how much of it do each of us as individuals actually see? A very, very small amount, a tiny sliver of the total available information. And we're making meaning from that tiny sample of information that we get. We're connecting the dots and we're reaching conclusions based on the bit of information we saw. So at least allow the possibility that what you've decided and what you believe could be wrong. We might be in error. And also our brains have to choose what to remember. There's so much information we cannot possibly remember it all. So we choose what to remember. And one of the ways we do that is to generalize. And that gives rise to things like fear and racism and all these things where we just generalize in ridiculous ways about people instead of treating each person as an individual to be evaluated separately. So those are some of the ways in which our brain is tricking us. In the next video, I'm going to talk a bit more about the work of Robert Cialdini, who has written a fantastic book about the principles of influence. And there are these 6 principles. that describe how we are influenced as human beings by things. We have reciprocity, where if somebody does us a favor, we have a strong influence to do them a favor back. It's just an inherent influence. We have authority, the authority principle. We're inclined to believe people who seem to be the experts. I've been caught by this twice myself in the last week and noticed it happening while it was happening. So at least I was aware of it. But it's very, very common. We're in front of an expert. They tell us to do something. We think, well, this person's an expert. They wouldn't mislead me. So this person's a doctor. They're highly trained. They have my best interests at heart. Why would they give me misleading information? Well, start to think that question through. You know, maybe they're being commissioned to sell a particular drug. That might be a reason why they accidentally mislead us sometimes. So that's the authority principle, trusting people in authority. The scarcity principle, we're really drawn to go after things that are scarce, to chase things that are scarce. We'll go into this in more detail in the next video. Consistency, if we say something publicly, we're very likely to then support it. You know, I talked about confirmation bias. If you express a firm opinion, you're very likely to defend that opinion and look for evidence to support your opinion because you don't want to be proved wrong. But what kind of victory is that really? Defending an opinion that's not very useful or actually might be wrong. Likability, we're very likely to get into rapport and easily communicate and follow people who are very like ourselves, who are similar to ourselves, and we have similarity and consensus. We'll go into all of these in more detail in the next video. But be aware that all of these influences, these cognitive biases, these beliefs, these standards, these cultural influences, all are acting on us to create the matrix we're living in. So just be aware you're living in a matrix and examine it, question it, think for yourself and question it. So specifically, things you can do. Number one, identify your own deeply held beliefs. There's a particular author I've been reading this week who suggests that each one of us has a big personal lie that affects everything we do in our lives. So what is your big personal lie that you've been telling yourself for years and years and years? That it might be that you're unworthy, or it might be that people don't love you, or it might be that you have to prove yourself, or all these kinds of things that we tend to keep as a subconscious big belief about our lives. What are your personal beliefs about yourself? Who do you think you are? We'll go into this in further detail in later videos as well. Who is it that you think you are? And who are you really compared with the story you tell yourself? So identify your beliefs and your generalizations. What generalizations do you make to make life understandable? What do you generalize about? Secondly, notice your common biases. I do recommend you have a look at the list of cognitive biases. Go to Wikipedia, you see a whole long list there. Which ones do you commonly fall foul of? Because we all do, we're all susceptible to them. Be aware that our brain is taking shortcuts and making things up based on these cognitive biases. And number three, just keep critically examining what is true. Ask yourself all the time, but is that true? Might something else be true? Or might a modified version of this be true? Be open to evidence, be open to persuasion. There's really no shame in being proven wrong about something. Really, the shame is going to your grave defending your belief in something that is wrong. That's really the shame. So be willing to be persuaded that something you deeply hold as true might not be. But at the same time, be vigilant of taking on everybody else's beliefs, because we are social creatures and we tend to believe what the people around us and close to us believe. People like us. We tend to believe what people like us believe. If you want to be a leader, you have to make your own mind up. You have to make your own independent decisions. And if that means you're going to decide something different and do something different to all of your friends and colleagues because it's the right thing for you, then really do it. And good luck to you, because that's leadership. That's what the world needs more of, more leadership. What a good note to end. So I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much for listening.